Everybody in Cedar Hollow had a theory about the straw house, and not one of them was kind. Some said the man who built it had gone soft in the head from too many winters alone up the ridge. Some said he was poor as a church mouse and too proud to beg lumber off the mill. The Reverend said it was a sign, though he was never clear of what. And the boys in the saloon, who'd never built so much as a chicken coop, laughed every time the wind came down off the mountain, because surely, the first real gale would scatter that house across the valley like chaff off a thrashing floor. I laughed too. God forgive me, I laughed the loudest. I was wrong about everything. About the house. About the man. About the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, the kind that builds quiet and waits. By the time I understood what those straw walls were really holding up, half this town was standing in the snow with their hats in their hands, and not one of us could find a single word to say. This is how it happened. I've kept the ledger of it the way I keep everything, because if I don't write a thing down, I start to doubt it ever happened at all. And there are nights now I need the proof. The first time I saw the house, it was burning. Not all of it, I want to be honest, and a man who exaggerates his first sentence has nothing left to spend on the rest. It was the lean-to off the east wall, a little goat shed he'd thrown up out of the same baled straw as the rest, and it was burning the way dry grass burns, fast and orange and mean, throwing sparks at a sky that had gone the color of a bruise. I'd ridden up the ridge that evening to tell the man his fence line had drifted onto my grazing, which was the sort of grievance I carried up mountains in those days. I was 31 years old and angry about most things, and a crooked fence was as good a reason as any to feel righteous. I forgot all about the fence. He was already out front of it when I came over the rise, this big slow shape against the fire, and he wasn't running for water. That was the first thing struck me as wrong. A man's outbuilding catches and he runs for the well, for a bucket, for anything. This one was just standing, and then he wasn't standing. He was walking into it, into the doorway of that burning shed, with his coat pulled up over the lower half of his face and his shoulders hunched like a man walking into hard rain. I got down off my horse before I decided to. I remember my boots hitting the dirt and the heat already finding me from 40 feet off, and I remember thinking, clear as a bell, that fool is going to die for a goat. He came out backward, dragging something. I had my mouth open to shout, and what came out the door with him wasn't a goat at all. It was a child. A girl, maybe 7, 8, limp as wet wash over his arm, her nightdress smoking at the hem. He went down on his knees in the dirt away from the fire and laid her out flat and put his ear to her chest, and the firelight was on his face then, and I saw him for the first time the way you really see a person, which is to say, I saw what he was afraid of. He had a face like a mountain himself, broad and weathered and closed up, a gray beard gone wild, eyes set deep where the weather couldn't reach them. Not a face that gave anything away, but it was giving everything away now. "Breathe," he said, just the one word, low, like he was asking a debt of her. "Breathe, girl, breathe." I came down on my knees on the other side of her. I didn't know what I meant to do. I had 200 head of cattle and a dead father's ranch, and a reputation for being hard, and I had never in my life been useful to a single living thing the way that man needed someone useful right then. She breathed. It came out of her in a cough that sounded like it tore something, and then another, and her eyes came open and rolled and found his face, and the thing that crossed his expression then, I will not be able to describe to you properly no matter how many times I write it down. It was relief, but relief is too clean a word. It was a man being handed back the only thing that kept him standing upright in the world. "There," he said, "there now." And he gathered her up off the ground like she weighed nothing. She nearly did, I'd learn. She was sick that whole winter, and he carried her past me toward the house, the real house, the straw one, and only at the door did he stop and look back at me over his shoulder, like he'd just remembered I existed. "The shed'll burn out on its own," he said. "Nothing in it now but straw and air. You can help me or you can ride home, but I'd be obliged if you'd shut that door behind you either way. The cold gets into her chest. I went in. I told myself it was because of the girl. The truth, I think now, is that I had never in my life heard a man speak to me as though I were welcome to leave. Everyone I'd ever known had wanted something from me or had given up on getting it. He'd offered me the door like a gift, and so of course I stayed. Inside, the straw house was warm. I don't know how to make you understand how strange that was. It was October, near the top of a ridge where the wind came off the snowcaps with teeth in it, and my own ranch house, good sawn lumber, my father's pride, drafty as a barn, was never warm, not really, not in the bones of it. You sat close to the stove or you shivered. But the straw house held its heat the way a held breath holds warmth, close and even all through, so that when the door shut behind me the cold I'd carried in seemed to simply stop being a thing that mattered. The walls were near 3 feet thick. I put my hand flat on the plaster. He'd skimmed the bales over with mud and lime so from inside you'd never know it was straw at all, and it gave back the warmth of the room to my palm. There was a stove in the corner, small, and it could not by itself have done what that room was doing. The walls were doing it. The walls were keeping the mountain out. He'd laid the girl on a low bed near the stove and was tucking a wool blanket up under her chin, and a second figure had come out of the back. A woman, I thought first, then saw she was younger, maybe 16, dark-haired, dark-eyed, with a stillness to her that I took at first for fear and only later understood was something more like watchfulness. She moved to the girl's other side without a word and set the back of her hand against the child's forehead, and the two of them, the big old man and the silent girl, worked over the little one in a kind of practiced quiet that told me they'd done it before. Many times. This was not the first night they'd fought to keep a child breathing in this house. "Daniel," the old man said to me finally, when the girl had quieted and her eyes had drifted shut and her breath had settled into something that didn't tear at the listening. He held out a hand the size of a dinner plate. "Daniel Mercer." "Tom Sayer," I said and took it. Now I had heard the name. Everybody in Cedar Hollow had heard the name Daniel Mercer, and everybody had an opinion fixed and set about the man, and none of those opinions had a thing to do with a sick child or a warm wall. The Daniel Mercer of the valley's telling was a hermit, a crank, a man who'd come up from somewhere south after the war with a wagon and a mule, and built himself a haystack to live in, and kept to himself in a way the town found suspicious on principle. The Daniel Mercer of the valley's telling consorted with Apache. That last part was true as it happened. The girl with the dark eyes was Apache, so was the child on the bed. And in 1879, in a town like ours, in a territory like ours, with the things that had happened in the years just before, there is no soft way to say what that meant to people. It meant the man was beyond the pale. It meant decent folk crossed the road. It meant that, when his goat shed burned, not one of his neighbors in the valley below would have ridden up the ridge to help him. Not one, I include myself. I'd come up to argue about a fence. I looked at the child sleeping by the stove, her small chest rising and falling in the warm dark, and I looked at the man who'd walked into fire to pull her out, and I felt something turn over in me that I had no name for and didn't like. It felt like shame. I'd ridden up here certain of my own goodness, the way a man is certain of the ground, and the certainty had just dropped out from under me. "That's Nolan," Mercer said, nodding at the older girl who had not yet spoken and would not for some time. "And this here's Katori. She's been sick since the leaves turned. Lungs." He said it the way another man might say the bank's foreclosing, a fact settled, costing him everything and no use crying over. "Doc Hewitt down in the hollow won't ride up. I don't blame him. I wouldn't ride up to a place like this either. If I were a man with a practice to protect." He said it without bitterness. That was the thing about Daniel Mercer I'd come to understand over that winter. He had emptied himself out of bitterness somewhere along the road, the way you'd empty a canteen you couldn't afford the weight of. He carried no grudges. He had no room for them. Whatever space a man usually keeps for resentment, Mercer had given over entirely to the keeping of those two girls, and there was nothing left in him for hatting the people who wouldn't help. I had plenty of room for it. I'm ashamed to say I went home that night and lay awake hatting Doc Hewitt with a clean hot fury, as though I had not been, that very afternoon, exactly the same kind of man. I went back. That's the part I find hardest to explain to people when I tell this, why I went back. I had no reason to. The fence was nothing, a few feet of grazing, and a sensible man would have written off the whole strange evening and stayed down in the valley where things made sense. But I kept thinking about the warmth in the walls, and I kept thinking about the way the child breathed, that tearing cough, and how Mercer had said lungs like a sentence already handed down. And I had, I'll be honest, because the ledger doesn't lie even when I'd like it to. I had a brother once, younger than me, who died of his lungs in a cold house in a cold winter when I was a boy, coughing like that. And my father had been a hard man who would not call the doctor because of the cost, and I had lain in the next room listening to it stop. I didn't think about that consciously when I saddled up the next morning with a sack of flour and a side of bacon tied behind me. I told myself I was a neighbor doing a neighborly thing. But the body remembers what the mind won't, and I think some part of me was riding up that ridge to do for a stranger's child what no one had done for my brother. Mercer met me at the door. He looked at the flour and the bacon, and then at me for a long moment with those deep-set eyes that didn't give anything away. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know it." He nodded slowly like I'd passed a test I hadn't known I was sitting. "Come in then. She's worse this morning. I could use the hands." And that was how it started, my winter on the ridge. I didn't tell anyone in the hollow where I was riding off to 2 and 3 days a week. I knew what they'd say. I told myself I'd stop going as soon as the child was on the mend, and then the child was not on the mend, and the snows came early and hard that year, and somewhere in there the lie I'd told myself about being a neighbor wore through, and what was underneath it was just a plain wish. I wanted that little girl to live. I wanted it the way you want very few things in a life, simple and total, with no profit in it for me at all. It was, I think, the first thing I'd wanted in years that wasn't really about me. It was that second week, sitting at his rough table while the wind screamed off the peaks, and Katori slept the thick sleep of the feverish and Nolan sat sentry beside her, that I finally asked him, "Why straw, Daniel?" He was carving. He was always carving little things, a habit of his hands, a horse here, a bird there, which he gave to Katori one at a time as though doling out something precious. He didn't look up. "Why not straw?" he said. "Because the whole valley thinks you're cracked. Because every man down there is sure the next big wind takes the roof off. Because you had a wagon and a mule and the strength of an ox when you came up here by all accounts, and you could have felled timber and built a proper house and nobody would have had a thing to say about you. But you built a haystack." I leaned in. "You're not a foolish man. I've watched you a fortnight. You're about the least foolish man I ever met. So there's a reason, and I'd like to know it." He set the knife down. For a while he didn't say anything, and I thought I'd overstepped, the way you do with a private man. Then he got up slow and went to the wall, the thick warm wall, and put his big hand flat against it the way I had that first night. "Feel that?" he said. "Come here and feel it." I went and put my hand beside his. The plaster was warm. Outside the wind was trying to peel the world apart. Inside the warmth held, even, patient, like something alive and breathing slow. "Lumber's cold," Mercer said. "You know it. You live in a lumber house. Sun goes down, the cold comes through the boards like they weren't even there, and you feed the stove all night and you're still cold in the morning. A house like that for a child with bad lungs." He stopped. His jaw worked. "A house like that kills a child with bad lungs, slow, over a winter. The damp gets in the walls and the cold gets in the chest, and you can burn a forest's worth of wood and never get ahead of it." He pressed his hand flatter against the warm plaster, like he could feel something through it the rest of us couldn't. "Straw don't let the cold in," he said. "Build the walls thick enough, 3 foot, for you make a thing the winter can't get past. It holds the warm and it holds the dry. A lung-sick child can live a winter in a house like this that die in a house like yours." He turned and looked at me, and there it was again, that thing under the closed-up face, that thing he kept so carefully out of his voice. "I didn't build a haystack because I'm a fool, Tom. I built a thing that could keep a child alive through the cold. That's all the house is. That's all it ever was. The walls are warm so she can be warm. There's no more reason to it than that." I looked at the little girl asleep by the stove, breathing, that night, easy, and I understood, suddenly and all at once, that everything I'd believed about the man and his house had been exactly upside down. The valley thought the straw house was the work of a man who'd given up on the world. It was the opposite. It was the work of a man who refused to give one single child up to it. But there was more. I could feel it, the way you can feel a deeper current under a river's surface. A child. That's all the house is. He'd built a whole house by hand, 3-foot walls, given up the respect of an entire valley for a child, and there was something in how he said it, some old grief folded so deep into the words I almost missed it, that told me Katori wasn't the first. That this was not the first child Daniel Mercer had built warm walls for. That somewhere behind those deep-set eyes was the reason behind the reason, the thing that had sent a strong man up a mountain to build a house out of straw, and that I had not even begun, that night, to understand it. I didn't ask. You don't with a man like that, you wait. I'm glad I waited. I'm not sure I could have carried what was coming if he'd handed it to me all at once. The fever broke 3 days later. I was there for it. Katori sat up near dawn and asked, in the small clear voice of a child surfacing from somewhere deep, whether there was anything to eat, and Nolan, silent Nolan, who I'd never once heard make a sound, let out a single broken laugh and pressed her face into her hands. And Daniel Mercer, that great closed mountain of a man, sat down hard on the floor by the bed like his legs had simply quit, and wept without any sound at all, the tears just running down into that wild gray beard, while he held the girl's small hand in both of his and could not, let it go. I went outside. Some things a man shouldn't watch. I stood in the snow with the whole white valley spread out cold and indifferent below me, the chimneys of Cedar Hollow smoking far down in the blue dark, all those warm, wrong houses full of people who decided what kind of man lived up on this ridge without ever once climbing up to see. And I made a decision, standing there, that I'd carry the rest of my life. I decided I was going to make them see. I didn't know yet what that would cost. I didn't know what was coming down out of those mountains that winter, or what the town would do, or what Daniel Mercer would have to give up, would choose to give up before the snow melted. I didn't know that the straw house had one more secret in its warm, thick walls, and that the day the valley finally learned it, there wouldn't be a dry eye or an unbowed head in the whole of Cedar Hollow. I only knew, that cold dawn, that I had ridden up a mountain an angry man with a grievance about a fence, and I was going to ride back down it changed. I just didn't know how much. The reason behind the reason came to me in pieces, over the deep part of that winter, the way a mountain comes clear when the fog burns off not all at once, but a ridge here, a shoulder there. Until one morning you look up, and the whole terrible shape of the thing is standing over you, and you wonder how you ever failed to see it. It started with the carving. I'd watched him whittle 100 little animals by then, horses and birds and a fat solemn bear that became Catori's favorite, but one night in January, with the snow piled to the windowsills and the stove ticking and the 2 girls asleep, I watched Daniel Mercer carve a different thing. A small figure. A person, not an animal. A little girl, you could tell, with a long line down her back that was hair, and her arms held out in front of her the way a child holds her arms to be picked up. He carved it slow, and when it was done he didn't give it to Catori. He set it on the high shelf over the stove, in a row with others I hadn't looked close at before. I looked at them now. There were 9. 9 small carved children, standing in a row in the warm dark above the fire. That's a lot of children, Daniel, I said. I meant it light. It didn't come out light. He was a long time answering. He turned the knife over in his hands, that big, careful hand that had pulled Cowboy out of the fire, and when he spoke his voice had gone somewhere I hadn't heard it go before. Down. Flat. The voice of a man reading from a ledger he'd rather burn. I was a soldier, he said. You'd guess that. I had. He carried it in his back, in the way he watched a doorway. In 100 small soldiers' habits a man never fully sets down. Cavalry, out of the campaigns after the war proper was done and they sent us out here to do the other war, the one nobody back east wanted to hear the particulars of. He set the knife down. I won't dress it up for you, Tom. You'll want me to. People always want a man to dress these things up so they can keep on thinking soldiering's a clean profession. It isn't. Out here it wasn't. We did things to the Apache that I will not say out loud in a house where those two are sleeping, because some of those things I did with my own hands, and the worst of them I did to people who couldn't fight back. The stove ticked. The wind worked at the eaves and got nowhere, the way it always got nowhere against those walls. There was a camp, he said, up in the Dragoons, winter like this one. We'd been told there were raiders sheltering in it, and maybe there were, I don't know. By then it didn't much matter to anyone what was true. We came down on it before light. The way you do. The way I'd done a dozen times and would tell myself afterward every time that the men we killed were men who'd have killed us. He stopped. I waited. I have learned in this life that the most useful thing one person can do for another is to sit still and not fill the silence with himself. It wasn't men, he said at last. Or it was some. But mostly it was the old ones who couldn't run fast enough and the women and the children. We'd been told fighters. There weren't fighters. There was a winter camp of hungry people who'd come down low to get out of the wind, same as anybody. And we didn't find that out until it was light enough to see what we'd done, and by then. His hand closed into a fist on the table and opened again, slow, deliberate, like he was making himself let go of something. There was a girl, he said, maybe Catoryquotes age. She'd run from the shooting and got into a stand of brush and she was just sitting there, frozen, not from cold, from fright, the way a rabbit freezes. And I came on her and I had my carbine up and for 1 second, Tom, for 1 second I was going to. Because that was the order and a frightened man follows the order so he doesn't have to be a man making a choice. And then she looked up at me. He was quiet a moment. She had her arms out, like a child does, like she still thought even then that a grown person coming toward her in the dark might be coming to pick her up. I didn't move. I lowered the carbine, he said, and I picked her up, and I carried her out of that camp under my coat, and another trooper saw me do it, and I told him she was dead and I was moving the body, and he believed me because he wanted to, because believing me let him not look too close at the thing we'd all just done. And I rode out of those mountains with a living Apache child against my chest, and I never went back to the army, and I've been carrying children out of the cold ever since. He looked up at the row of carved figures over the stove. That girl was the first, he said. She lived 4 winters with me. Lungs in the end she'd taken something into her chest that first cold night that never did leave it. I had a lumber house then down in the flats, and I fed the stove till my hands bled and I couldn't keep her warm enough, and she went the way they go, slow, over a winter, coughing in a cold room. His voice did not break. That was the worst of it, it did not break. It had broken a long time ago and set wrong like a bone, and this was just the shape it healed into. I buried her and I sat by that grave and I thought, I will never again be unable to keep a child warm, whatever it costs, whatever they think of me. I will build a thing the winter cannot get into, and I will fill it with the ones nobody else will take, and I will keep them warm if it's the last useful thing this pair of hands ever does. He nodded at the wall, at the thick warm wall that the whole valley laughed at. So, that's your reason, Tom. You ask me why straw. That's why straw. Every one of those carvings is a child I couldn't keep warm fast enough before I learned how. And every cold night I keep one of them living through, I figure that's one less I'll have to carve. I did not say anything for a long time. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have been an insult to the size of it. I have set down a great many words in this ledger over the years, and I have never once found the ones that belonged in that silence. Finally, I said the only true thing I had. How many of you kept warm, Daniel? Living ones. How many made it? He almost smiled. It was a terrible thing to watch, that almost smile with all that grief behind it. Counting these two, he said, 19. 19. I wrote it in my ledger that night, the number, because I knew even then I would need the proof. 19 children, carried out of the cold by a man the valley below had decided was a worthless old crank in a haystack. 19. And 9 he hadn't reached in time, carved and standing watch over the stove, so he'd never let himself forget the cost of being too slow. The storm that changed everything came in the last week of January. I have lived my whole life in this country, and I have seen weather that killed men and cattle by the score, but I had not before that week seen the mountain do what it did. The sky went the color of a gun barrel by noon, and the temperature dropped like a stone down a well, and by dark the snow wasn't falling so much as being thrown, sideways, a white roaring nothing that swallowed the world 10 feet past the window. I'd ridden up that morning with provisions, and I was not riding down. No man would have. We were sealed into the straw house, the 4 of us, while the mountain tried all night to tear the ridge off the earth. The walls held. Of course they held. Outside, the wind could have stripped paint off a barn. Inside, Catori slept and the stove ticked and the carved children kept their watch, and you could have believed, if you tried, that the world was a gentle place. It was near midnight that we heard the knocking. Not the wind. The wind doesn't knock. It claws and it howls and it leans, but it doesn't knock in fives, deliberate, weakening, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then a pause, then again fainter. A human hand on the door. Nahlin was up before any of us, fast and silent, and she had the bar off the door, and it opened against the screaming wind before Mercer could cross the room, and what fell in across the threshold on a blast of snow was a man. An Apache man near frozen, his face gone gray and his lips the color of slate, and behind him in the white roaring dark more. I counted them as Mercer and I hauled them in, because counting is the thing my hands do when my mind has gone out from under me. 11. 11 souls, half of them children, all of them 3 hours from dead, stumbled and crawled and were carried in out of that storm into the one warm room on the whole frozen mountain. They were Nahlin Quotes people. I understood that without being told, from the sounds she made, sounds I'd never heard her make. The silent girl suddenly pouring out words in a language I didn't know, on her knees in the snow melt by the door, holding the face of an old woman between her 2 hands and weeping. Survivors. The remnant of a band that had been driven up into the high country by soldiers that autumn and had been hiding and starving and dying ever since, and had come down at last in the worst storm of the winter, because down was the only direction left that wasn't death. They'd come to Mercer because the word had gotten out, somehow, the way it does among people the world is trying to erase, that there was a warm house on the ridge above Cedar Hollow, and a gray-bearded man in it who would not turn an Apache child out into the cold. We got them by the stove. We got hot water and what food there was into them. The old woman lived. 2 of the children were so far gone that for an hour I was sure we'd be carving figures by spring. But the warmth, that patient, even warmth in those thick walls, the warmth brought them back the way it had brought Cowboy back, slow, from somewhere far off. By the gray light of morning, 11 living people were crowded into Daniel Mercer's straw house, and the storm had blown itself out, and the mountain was white and silent and pitiless under a hard blue sky, and we had a problem none of us wanted to be the first to name. Mercer named it. He always named the hard thing. It was the soldier in him, or maybe just the man. "They can't stay," he said low to me by the stove, while the others slept the dead sleep of the rescued. "Not all of them, not for long. 11 more mouths, I haven't the food, I haven't the room, and worse than that, he looked at the window down toward the valley. The army's hunting this band. Captain Reese has had patrols out of the fort all winter. If word gets down to the hollow that there's 11 Apaches sheltering up here, it won't be Laughter that comes up the ridge this time. It'll be Reese. And he'll take them. And he'll take Nolan and Katori with them, because to a man like Reese an Apache child is just a smaller enemy. And he'll burn this house, and there won't be a soul in Cedar Hollow who lifts a finger to stop him, because they've spent 3 years deciding I'm the kind of man it's all right to do that too. It was the truth, every word of it. I'd lived among those people my whole life. I knew exactly what they'd do. So what do we do? I said. And here is where I come to the part of this account that I have rewritten more times than any other, because it contains a choice, and I have never been certain all the years since whether it was the right one. I set it down plain and let you judge. That's all a ledger's good for in the end. It can't tell you what was right. It can only tell you what was done. Mercer was quiet a long while. Then he said, "The band has to move, down out of the territory south across into Mexico where Reese can't follow. There's people will take them in if they can reach the border, but they can't reach it on foot in winter, starving with children. They'd need horses, food. They'd need a man who knows the back country to guide them past the patrols." He looked at me, and I felt the whole weight of what he was about to say land on me before he said it. "And the only man on this mountain who knows that country and has horses to spare, and a name the patrols won't stop and search." "Is me," I said. "Is you," he said. "I can't go, Tom. If I leave, who keeps the girls warm? Katori won't live a guide's journey in winter, her lungs won't take it. She has to stay here in the walls, and I have to stay with her. Which means if these 11 are going to live." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. "I want to tell you I said yes right away. I didn't. I sat there by that stove with 11 sleeping strangers around me, and I thought about what it would cost, not in horses. The horses were nothing. I thought about what would happen to me if I were caught guiding a band of fugitive Apache to the border. I thought about my ranch, my father's ranch, my name in the valley, my whole settled certain life down in the hollow. A man who did this thing and was caught did not go back to being a respectable rancher. He went to a cell, or worse, and everything he'd been was burned down behind him. I thought about all of it, clearly, coldly, the way I think when it matters most. And then I thought about my brother coughing in the next room while my father counted the cost of a doctor. And I thought about the 9 carved children over the stove. And I thought about a frightened girl in a stand of brush holding her arms up to a man with a carbine, still believing, even then, that a grown person might be coming to pick her up and not to kill her. "All right," I said, "I'll take them." Mercer closed his eyes, just for a second. When he opened them they were wet, and he reached across and gripped my forearm with that enormous hand, and he said, "I have been a long time, Tom, looking for a man down in that valley I could believe was decent. A long time." He let go. "I'm sorry it had to cost you so much to be the one." We left 2 nights later in the dark of the moon, 11 Apache and 1 fool rancher and 9 of my best horses, down off the ridge by the old game trails and out across the white country south, away from Cedar Hollow, away from the warm house, away, I was certain, riding out from the whole of the life I'd known. I'll tell you of the journey in its place. It nearly killed us all, and it cost more than I'd reckoned, and there is a grave out there in the South Country I cannot visit and have never stopped seeing. But that is the next part of it. What I'll set down here to close is the thing I didn't know as I rode out that night with my back to the straw house and my collar up against the cold. I didn't know that while I was gone, the word would get down to the valley after all. I didn't know that Captain Reese would come up the ridge with 20 men, just as Mercer had said he would, and find the straw house standing warm and quiet in the snow. And I did not know, could not have known, what Daniel Mercer would do when they came, what he chose to give up, to keep 2 sleeping girls warm and breathing behind those thick walls one more night. I only know what I came back to, 3 weeks later, half frozen and grieving and changed past my own recognition, riding up that ridge with my heart in my throat. I'll tell you what I found there. But not yet. My hand's shaking, and the ledger deserves a steady hand for that part. The boy died on the 9th night, and I buried him in country that had no name I knew, under a sky so full of stars it seemed like a cruelty. He was one of the two who'd come in near frozen that first storm night, the small quiet one, maybe 5, who'd clung to the old woman the whole journey and never made a sound, the way the frightened ones learn not to. He'd come back from the edge of death in Mercer's warm walls. He didn't come back from the trail. There's only so much a child's body has in it, and we'd spent his keeping him alive that first night, and the cold south country took back what the straw house had loaned. He went in his sleep, against the old woman's chest, and in the morning she would not let me take him for a long time, and when she finally did she made a sound I have not been able to forget and do not expect to. We buried him in frozen ground we broke with our hands in a single spade, and I marked the place the only way I could with a cairn of stones, and I stood over it after the others had moved on, and I understood finally in my own body what those 9 carvings on Mercer's shelf were. They were not memorials. They were accusations a man had agreed to live under. You were too slow. You were too late. Carry it. I have carried that boy ever since. I never carved him a figure. I didn't earn the right. Mercer earned his by trying to keep those children warm with his own 2 hands and failing, and all I'd done was lead one out into the cold to die. But I think of him, the quiet boy, more nights than not. That is the grave in the south country I told you of. That is the one I cannot visit and have never stopped seeing. We reached the border on the 19th day. I will not pretend it was triumphant. There were 10 of us by then where there'd been 11, gaunt and frostbitten and half out of our minds with cold and hunger, and the people who took them in on the far side, a settlement of others who'd made the same crossing in earlier years, did it quietly, without ceremony. The way you take in folk when taking them in is dangerous and ordinary both. The old woman held my face in her 2 hands the way Nolan had held hers that first night, and said something I didn't understand. And one of the younger men who had a little English told me she was asking the spirits to keep me warm. Then they were gone south, into a country I'd never see, and I turned my horses north toward home with 3 weeks of hard riding ahead of me, and the whole way to wonder what I'd find at the end of it. I worried the whole ride. Not about myself, that's the strange thing. I'd ridden out terrified of what guiding that band would cost me, my ranch, my name, my whole settled life. And somewhere out in that nameless south country, burying a child with my hands, I'd stopped caring about any of it. The ranch could fall down. The valley could think what it liked. I found I'd spend the rest of it, all of it, gladly to have kept that quiet boy breathing. But I'd spent it and he died anyway, and that is a lesson about the cost of doing right that nobody warns you of. Sometimes you pay the whole price and don't get the thing you paid for. Sometimes you just get the bill. I worried about the house, about the girls, about the big closed-up man who told me the night before I left that he'd been a long time looking for someone decent in that valley and was sorry it had cost me so much to be the one. I should have worried more. I knew something was wrong before I reached the top of the ridge. There was no smoke. In all the weeks I'd ridden up to that house, in the worst of the winter there had always been smoke from the stove, thin and gray and steady against the sky, the sign of the warmth being kept, the fire being fed, the work going on. There was no smoke now. The house stood in the snow exactly as it had always stood, square and humble and thick-walled, and not one breath of smoke rose from it. And the silence as I came up the last of the trail was the silence of a held breath that has gone on too long to be anything but the end of breathing. The door was open, swinging a little in the wind. I will set down what I found inside as plainly as I can. I have found, over the years, that the plain telling is the only one a thing like this will bear. Dress it up and it turns false, and false is the one thing I will not be to that man's memory. The house had been searched. Not wrecked. Reese was not whatever else he was, a man who took pleasure in breaking things but searched thoroughly the way soldiers search, the bed overturned, the floor pried up in two places, the stores scattered. They had been looking for people, for Apache, for the band and for two girls. They had not found them. I knew that within a minute of standing in that cold, ransacked room, because of the wall. You'll remember I told you the walls were near 3 feet thick. What I did not know, what I'd had no reason to learn in all my weeks in that house, was that Daniel Mercer, who built everything with a purpose and wasted nothing, had not built those walls solid all the way through. In the thickest of them, the great north wall that took the worst of the wind, he'd left a hollow, a space. A child-sized space behind a plastered panel that, closed, looked like nothing but more warm wall, and that he'd lined with straw and a blanket so that a child hidden in it would be not just concealed but warm, kept breathing, kept alive. In the one place in the house no searching soldier would ever think to look, because who builds a hiding place into the very walls of his home and lines it to keep a child from taking cold? A man does. One man I knew of. A man who had decided, kneeling at a grave a long time ago, that he would build a thing the winter could not get into and fill it with the ones nobody else would take. The panel was open when I found it, empty now. But there was a blanket in it, and the blanket still held, faintly, the shape of two small bodies that had lain there pressed together, and on the floor below it, dropped or set down, was the little carved bear, Katori's bear, the fat solemn one, her favorite. They had been here. They had been hidden here in the warm dark inside the wall while Reese's men tore the house apart around them, and they had lived. I found that out for certain an hour later, but I'll tell you the rest in its order, because the order is the thing that left me on my knees on that cold floor, and I think it's the order that will do the same to you. I went looking for Mercer. He was out behind the house in the lee of the burned-out goat shed where the snow had drifted deep. They'd buried him shallow, or the cold had. I never learned which, and it doesn't matter. He'd been dead some days. There was a wound, I'll not describe it. I'll only tell you it was the kind a man takes standing in a doorway he will not move out of, facing people who have told him to step aside, refusing. He had not stepped aside. He had stood in the door of that house with 20 armed men in front of him and 2 children hidden in the wall behind him, and when they ordered him to stand down and let them search, he had not let them search the way they wanted to, fast, careless, a man pointing them where to look to save his own skin. He had made them work for it. He had stood in that doorway and given them every reason to believe the band had already fled south, and that the house was empty of all but a mad old hermit, and he had drawn it out, and argued, and delayed, and not stepped aside long enough, I am certain, for 2 frightened girls to get themselves into the wall and pull the panel shut. And it had cost him what it cost him. I learned the particulars later from a trooper who'd been there and could not afterward keep it down. Reese had not meant to kill him. That's the part the valley couldn't stomach in the end. There was no villain to point at, no monster, just a frightened young captain and a stubborn old man in a doorway, and a thing that happened fast in the cold and could not be unhappened. Mercer had refused a direct order to clear the door. There'd been a scuffle, a carbine. The trooper said the old man went down still arguing, still drawing it out, still buying his girls one more minute of warm, hidden dark, and that the last thing he did on the ground was laugh. Not a bitter laugh. The trooper couldn't account for it, and it had haunted him into telling me. The old man had looked up at them all, dying in the snow, and he had laughed like a man who'd won. He had, I knew why, even if the trooper didn't. He'd kept them warm. To the last useful thing his 2 hands ever did, he kept 2 children warm and hidden and alive, and the winter had not gotten past his walls, and he had finally, after all the carvings, after all the cold rooms and slow goings, been fast enough. He'd died ahead of the cold instead of behind it. For a man like Daniel Mercer, that was a thing worth laughing at the sky about. Reese's men left him where he fell and rode back down to the valley and reported the band escaped and the hermit dead, resisting a lawful search. And the valley, I am told, mostly nodded and said it was a shame, but what could you expect? A man who'd lived like that, consorting like that. And that would have been the end of it. That would have been the whole of what Cedar Hollow ever knew. Except I came back, and except for the wall. The girls were in a root cellar a half-mile up the ridge, where some instinct had sent them after they dared at last to come out of the wall and found what was in the snow behind the house. Nolan had gotten them there. 16 years old, and she kept a sick 8-year-old alive 3 days in a root cellar in deep winter, on what little she could scavenge, waiting for what, I don't know, for nothing maybe, for the next bad thing. They had learned, those two, not to expect a good one. When I came down into that cellar with a lantern, Katori looked up at me, and her small face went through something I will not forget. Fear first, always fear first, with those children, and then the slow dawning that the grown person coming toward her in the dark might, this once, be coming to pick her up. And she held out her arms. I have thought a great deal since about what Mercer told me about the first girl in the brush, holding out her arms even then. I think now that was the thing he could never get over, the thing that turned a soldier into whatever he became. That a child who had every reason in the world to expect the worst from us would still, hold out her arms in hope. I think he spent the rest of his life trying to be worthy of that hope. I think he mostly was. I picked her up. I carried her out of the cold. Now I'll tell you about the town, because the title of this account promises it, and because it's the truest part and the part I understand the least. I could have taken the girls and said nothing, slipped them away south to follow the band, kept Mercer's grave a secret, let the valley go on believing what it found comfortable to believe. It would have been safer. I'd have had a reason for everything. I didn't. I rode down into Cedar Hollow with Nolan and Katori wrapped in blankets behind me, and I went to the church on a Sunday with the whole valley in it, and I stood up in the back where everyone could hear, and I told them. All of it. The fire and the warm walls and the 19 children and the 9 carvings, the first girl in the brush, the band in the storm, the wall with the hollow in it, lined to keep a child warm while soldiers tore the house apart a foot away, and the doorway, and the laugh. I'm not a speaker. I had no eloquence in me. I just told it plain, the way the ledger taught me, one true thing after another, and I held up Katori's little carved bear at the end of it because I didn't have any better way to make them see. And the valley went quiet. I have seen that town loud in grief and loud in joy and loud, God knows, in judgment. I had never seen it like this. There was a silence in that church that I have not been able to describe to anyone in all the years since. A silence with a weight to it. A silence of 100 people who had spent 3 years being absolutely certain about a man, and had just been shown, all at once, the exact size and shape of how wrong they'd been. Doc Hewitt, who wouldn't ride up the ridge, was crying without bothering to hide it. The boys from the saloon who'd laughed at the haystack were studying the floor. The Reverend, who'd called the house a sign and never said of what, the Reverend had no words at all, and a man who makes his living from words and finds himself without any is a thing worth seeing once and never wishing to see again. They went up the ridge the next day, most of the valley. In the snow, on foot and on horse, the whole settlement that had decided years ago that decent folk crossed the road from Daniel Mercer. They climbed up to his house, and they stood in front of those thick warm walls they'd laughed at, and they looked at the row of 9 carved children over the cold stove, and they looked at the hollow in the wall with the blanket still holding the shape of 2 small bodies, and not one of them, not one in the whole crowd of them, could find a single thing to say. I watched them. I'll be honest, there was a part of me, the old hard part, that wanted to be glad of it, wanted to say, now you see, now you know what you scorned. But standing there in the snow with my hat in my hands like the rest of them, I found I had no gladness in it at all. There was nothing to win. There never had been. A good man was dead in the ground behind the house. A quiet boy was dead in the south country, and a whole valley standing speechless in the snow couldn't buy back 1 minute of either of them. The reckoning came too late for the only people it would have mattered to. It always does. I think that's the thing the cold teaches, in the end, if you stay out in it long enough. That being right about a man after he's gone is the cheapest thing in the world, and the most useless, and that the only payment worth anything is the kind you make while he can still feel the warmth of it. We buried him properly, up there on the ridge, with the whole valley watching and the Reverend finally finding a few words and none of them adequate. The girls stood at the front. Nalin did not weep this time. She had gone past it, into that watchful stillness I'd taken for fear the first night and understood now for what it was, the stillness of someone holding a great deal and refusing to set any of it down. I live in the straw house now. I sold the ranch. My father's pride, the good, cold, drafty lumber house. I sold it and the cattle and the name that went with it, and I moved up the ridge into the warm, thick walls, and the valley thinks I've gone the way they always said Mercer went, soft in the head from too much winter alone. Let them. I keep the stove fed. I keep the walls warm. Nalin and Katori are with me still, and Katori's lungs are stronger every year, and the warmth holds in those walls the way it held the night I first put my cold hand to them and felt the mountain stop mattering. There have been others, too, since the spring. A boy and his sister come up the back trails the way the word travels among the people the world is trying to erase. There's a warm house on the ridge and a man in it who won't turn an Apache child out into the cold. It's a different man now. They don't know that. It doesn't matter. The house doesn't care whose hands feed the stove. I've taken up the carving. My hands are clumsy at it and the animals come out looking like nothing on earth, and Katori laughs at them, which I count a victory worth more than the ranch I sold. On the high shelf over the stove, the 9 carved children still keep their watch, and I have not added to them, and I pray to a God I'm not sure of that I never will. Beside them now there's a new one I made badly, the only human figure I've managed, a big broad shape with a wild beard, standing, arms a little out from his sides. I set him at the end of the row, watching over the rest. It seemed right that he should be up there too, keeping the children warm. He'd have laughed at how poorly I carved him. I hope he did. I hope he's somewhere he can. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, when the wind comes down off the snowcaps with all its old teeth and gets nowhere against these walls, I put my hand flat against the warm plaster the way he taught me, and I think about how a frightened child will still hold out her arms in hope after everything, against all the evidence we ever gave her, and how a man can spend his whole life trying to be worthy of that, and mostly fail, and have it be enough anyway.